and I've learned it's important to, not heap up your measure. Some people even do it by weight because the flour can weigh more so that's a regular flour, 2 of those. And this is pastry flour, which doesn't look any different, but it's interesting to me because it actually feels more dense than the regular flour. It's supposed to make a lighter crust, but it feels more dense too. And I have no idea how the process is different to make it different from regular flour. But both of what I use are King Arthur flour. And then it's 2 tablespoons of sugar, but I do just grab a handful. And then 2 teaspoons of salt, which if you cook a lot, you'd measure. But you should probably measure 2 teaspoons of salt. And then 1 pound of butter. And I don't use any shortening. I know a lot of pastry chefs like to use, even if they use mostly butter, they like to use some shortening. I guess the dough's a little easier to work with. So you want to cut your butter. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet is it's important. It really helps for a lighter, flakier dough if your ingredients are cool or cold. So it's important to keep the butter cold. I even tried one time, and it worked great, but it was difficult. Keep using frozen butter and grating it into the dough. But I didn't think it was enough of a difference to be worth the difficulty. So as long as your butter's good and cold, cut it into chunks. This saves having to, I also use a pastry blender, but if you cut the chunks small enough to begin with, it saves your pastry blender because this one is Queasy Pro, which has held up the best, but I'm pretty rough on these things. And after 100 pies or so, these things get a little warped and weak here on the edges, but this one's my favorite so far. So then use the pastry blender and get some good arm muscles this way because your butter is cold, so it's firm. And so I cut it, you can see I cut it up pretty small to begin with, so it doesn't really take much with the pastry blender. Just want to get it, you still want the butter to be chunky, like maybe the size of peas, but some will be bigger. And the reason you don't want to blend the butter completely is when you cook the pie, it's the butter melting that creates space in the dough, and that's what makes it flaky. So if you've got your butter completely blended, then it doesn't leave any spaces there. So that's probably good enough. You can see there's still some pretty good sized chunks in there, but that's okay. And along with the most important cold ingredient is the water. And I always keep a little thing of ice in the freezer so that I can just add cold water to that and have good cold water. And with these proportions that I'm using, one reason I do this proportion is because it's easy. It's 5 of the flour, a whole chunk of butter, a whole pound of butter, and a whole cup of ice water. So that way I don't have to measure out tablespoons of anything. And just kind of sprinkle that over the top. And you'll note, if you make pies frequently, that the weather can make a big difference. Humid, I make a lot of blueberry pies in the summer, and I've threatened to set up my kitchen in our big walk-in cooler because it's so difficult to make pies in the humid weather, or if it's really warm, because the crust just kind of melts and sticks to everything, and it's hard to get that flakiness. So you can see this is still pretty loose and dry. But it's a temptation to add more water so that your dough will stick together better. But I think it was Cook's Illustrated does a lot of experimental, trying to achieve something with cooking, does a lot of experiments. And it's the water, you can see that still falling apart, but that's okay. It's the liquid in the pie dough that causes the gluten to, or reacts with the gluten and causes the tough dough. So that if you want your dough to be as dry as possible and still workable. So I don't measure the balls. I try to make them as equal as possible. This one's a little smaller, but for your bottom crust, a smaller one is okay. And if you really want to heap up your apples, it's nice to have a slightly bigger one to use for a top, because you've got to make that go further to cover. And then the dough relaxes, supposedly, if you stick it in the fridge for a half an hour at least. And that's really ideal. Take it out after half an hour, and you'll notice a difference in the texture. It's sort of, I guess, as they say, relaxed a little bit, a little less likely to fall apart. Good to have a little extra flour on the side. Sprinkle some on your cloth. Sprinkle some on the sock. Oh yes, this is going to be nice. So the other secret to a nice flaky dough is not to work the dough too much. So you'll notice that I didn't knead the dough when I was putting the balls together. The same is true when you're rolling it out. Don't overwork your dough, unless it's pizza or bread. And I like this. This is a really long, heavy-duty roller, but I really like having this much leverage. You just need to have a lot of counter space. I think this is an 18-inch, but it doesn't take much strength to get it to roll out. I'm not really applying much pressure at all. And you can see with the pastry dough, the cloth, it's not sticking at all. So sometimes I'll pick it up and turn it over. You can see where the chunks of butter were. So as this pie bakes, that's going to leave airspace as that butter melts and make a flaky crust. And the way I measure is I just stick a pie plate upside down. And I noticed my daughter was just using the crust like this, but I find it's easier to shave off all these little edges. It's just easier to pick it up and move it. And so I just kind of cut around it, leaving an inch or so. And it doesn't have to be perfectly round. And then I just roll it out a little more. And this is a 10-inch pie plate.